I'm really happy to start the workshop off with the first keynote. And last year, we realized there was quite a diverse background on like the knowledge of complex system or complexity science tools and that sort of stuff, and actually also the request to get a little bit of an overview of that. So we're going to start off with that. I'm really happy to have Dr. Vítor Vasconcelos with us. And actually, I got a tour in my first year of PhD on complexity science tools from you as well. So it is really good. I like it. Yeah, Vítor has a background in physics. He did his PhD in Portugal, and then he took his quantum systems thinking to Princeton University, where he worked in understanding how cooperation and collective behavior emerge. He's now an assistant professor here at the University of Amsterdam, where he studies how societies respond to big challenges. He also does a lot of work on complexity science and policy, where he founded together the Polder Institute and is also doing a master course on complex system and policy. Yeah, so he's at the center of really exciting work and really an expert on complex system tools and also how we can use those in our research or like with policy experts and beyond. Yeah, so we're really happy to have him here. I'm really happy that he made it and he's going to start off. And please help me in welcoming Vítor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. First of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation. These are big shoes to fill, so I'll do my best. I will, of course, have to start with the big overview of why complexity is important, is because we live in a time of complexity and we have a lot of big global challenges that we need to help address. And here illustrated by the climate stripes representing climate change, of course, polarization. Let me keep my pointer if you can see my pointer. Polarization, increased epidemics throughout the world, ecological collapse here. And of course, these are related to one another. So we need some tools to help address these challenges. When I say complexity, I would like to ask the audience what first comes to me. So here are some options, and I will read the 5 of them and then ask you to raise your hands. Okay, so the first one is, when you hear complexity, the word complexity, do you think of an advanced piece of technology like a space shuttle or nuclear fission reactor to address large such societal ambitions? Number 2, a multitude of factors constituting the cause and potential solutions for pressing societal challenges. 3, simple elements interacting with one another to generate large emergent phenomena. 4, the exponent of the scaling law of an algorithm. 5, something else. So who thinks of 1? Who thinks of 2? Okay. Who thinks of 3? Who thinks of 4? Who thinks of 5? Very good. It's great to see some kind of diversity that we have in the room. And of course, I'm not going to define complexity because that would be insane. But I want to start by dividing it in kind of 2 schools, let's say. The first one is here illustrated on the top left with a diagram that has multiple aspects of a system. These aspects actually have completely different dimensions. Some are social, some are more climate related. And it's this school of thinking of complexity in terms of systems thinking, in terms of multi-causality, that things are complicated and we want to figure out how all these various complicated things are pieced together. The other school that comes a bit more from the physical sciences, mathematics, is more related to the idea of complex systems as a collective of simple subsystems that interact with one another. And even those simple subsystems generate emergent phenomena that describe some derived property of these systems. And here it's illustrated by the starling murmuration. So the birds interacting with one another somehow generate this thing that has different densities, and it's not the birds, it's something at a larger scale. Okay. And of course, these two schools have a long history, and complexity itself has a long history. This is the map of complexity by Brian Castellani and others. It's an ongoing effort, some of which actually happened at the IIS not so long ago. And you see that, for instance, it starts with the specific fields like mathematics of complexity, systems theory, cybernetics, AI. And then through time, it kind of developed things that are closer to the tools that we use, some of the tools that we use to address complexity, for instance, systems dynamics, agent-based models, network science, economic complexity, big data. And then you see, this is a chronological, by the end of the 2010s, a lot of the fields or the subfields relate actually to applications. So we see there in the living systems, applications in healthcare and public health. We see applied complexity. We see complexity policy. And we see here at the bottom things like interdisciplinarity, but also case-based complexity, which means that over time, once we developed the tools, then the challenge became applying these tools to the real world. And that's, I think, where we are now. And it's also the mission of the Institute for Advanced Studies that you are now very familiar with. And it is a research, an interdisciplinary research institute focused on complexity. And the key mission is to create societal change, impact in societal challenges. And it has several research themes. You know, some are more applied, some are a bit more fundamental, as is the history of complexity. In parallel, at the University of Amsterdam, we also have the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, which is kind of the sibling part of the research at IIS, but the corresponding to education, where we do a lot of that is focused on transdisciplinary education, which means that we not only piece together different disciplines, but also contact with stakeholders, in this case, in the context of education. And we've created a new master program on complex systems and policy, where we work with stakeholders to address specific societal challenges. In this case, the two research themes are health and sustainability. So this is to give you an overview of complexity in general and how we're applying it. And here is just a simple example of how this could come about. So let's say you have, because complexity is a lot about applications and the needs of society on these complex societal issues, maybe a municipality like Amsterdam is faced with a map like this that describes the health outcomes in the city, throughout the city. And they look at it and they see, well, different regions have different levels of health outcomes, maybe because of food habits, maybe because of pollution, for a multitude of reasons, most likely. And they know that they want to improve the health outcomes throughout the city, and they want to reduce that inequality by reducing everyone's health outcomes. So they know what the problem is, they know where they want to go, but they need a roadmap to get it, right? And this is where complexity tools come. So this is a really nice diagram, also from a center based at the Institute for Advanced Studies here, the Center for Urban Mental Health. But I like it because it also describes pretty much the philosophy of complex systems. And it describes, in this case, how one could think of mental health in an urban context. And to do so, we need not only to think of the individuals who are here in the purple, but also much broader than that. So we need to look at these meta factors. So because it's about urban health, maybe factors that relate to the city, in this case, city size, population growth, level of urbanization, migration, economic development, as examples. These then affect, the households, the different social groups, and part of those are, of course, the individuals. And then within each individual are these networks of symptoms that interact with one another over time, and that also then lead to different comorbidities for them. But what I think is also particularly interesting is that not only it describes spatial scales at which these processes are happening, but also temporal scales. And then depending on the type of question that you might be addressing, then your subsystems might vary strongly. If you are curious, we will have the slides available so then you can also check the reference. Oh, and by the way, if you have clarifying questions throughout, I can take them. There's also a moment halfway through that where we can have some broader discussion before we continue. So yeah, just raise your hand. I'll take questions. At the University of Amsterdam, we have, of course, embraced this idea that complexity is now meant to be applied to different topics beyond just the fundamental research on complex systems. And one way that we go about it is through the Polder initiative. And here I'm just briefly highlighting the steps to it. And as you will see, I will show you a very short video. It embraces the idea that, well, as we have it, is siloed. So we need methods to unsilo knowledge. So these are participatory techniques. Then we need, of course, our deep dive into the system. We use modeling and simulation to create hypotheses about what could be good interventions that we could do to fix issues in these systems. And then we test those interventions and learn how our models are wrong. Because all models are wrong. So let me try to show you this video. How we do with the sound?
Good question. How about, yeah, I think if you play it and you have yours on now, that should work.
The world is getting more complex every day, and the challenges we face are becoming ever more interconnected. When tackling complexity, policymakers need to design holistic interventions that avoid unintended consequences. How do you make sure you don't
approach is continuous co-creation.
Mute yourself, then it should work. You want to try?
Oh, I guess you need to mute.
Yeah, I think you need.
And is there a place where I can remove these
Yeah, I
subtitles?
think maybe you go.
No.
Otherwise, you can maybe go to YouTube directly. You go, but must be linked to YouTube. No. We should fix this.
No. Copy link. There you go. Oh. No,
Approach is
it refuses.
to combine this.
I am. Okay, let's try again with the two subtitles. So just focus on one of them.
The world is getting more complex every day, and the challenges we face are becoming ever more interconnected. When tackling complexity, policymakers need to design holistic interventions that avoid unintended consequences. For example, how do you make sure you don't increase inequality when making decisions on climate change? And how can you address a problem like diabetes as a social and medical problem? Clearly, these complex challenges require collaboration between experts from different domains.
At Polder, we've developed a novel way to tackle complex problems. At the core of this approach is continuous co-creation with stakeholders. The unique aspect of this approach is to combine this continuous co-creation with advanced computational models that we can then use to simulate interventions.
The Polder approach brings decision makers, academics, and experts together to unravel complex challenges, create actionable insights, and explore new avenues of intervention.
The mission of the Institute for Advanced Study of the University of Amsterdam is to stimulate researchers to work in interdisciplinary ways and to engage with complex societal and scientific challenges. With the Polder initiative, we want to develop all kinds of tools and instruments and models to support policymakers. We really want to foster their imagination to tackle complex societal and scientific challenges.
Through group model building, Polder creates a shared understanding. This is translated into mathematical and computational models. The result is a virtual playground where policymakers can simulate what-if scenarios to help them decide on the best course of action.
To date, we've applied the Polder approach in a number of different projects. These include a wide range of different partners, from the Dutch police to Amsterdam municipality, and many more.
At Polder, we support policymakers in tackling complex challenges, utilising complexity modelling as a sense-making tool to develop interventions at the system level. A holistic approach like this is paramount for an ever more interconnected world.
Through our research and collaborations, we create the opportunity to move policymaking into the realm of systems thinking. This paves the way for a new paradigm in solving conflict.
As complexity increases and society becomes ever more interconnected, Polder is here to help co-create tomorrow's policy interventions. Visit polder.center to discover how you can co-create with us.
All right. So maybe now we do the switcheroo with the micros. All right, great. So this is kind of a summary of the things that we do and want to continue doing in the flows from now. Here was the good thing. So to do this, of course, we need not only good models, good processes of creating shared mental models of how the world works, but we also need rich data sets. And luckily, the Netherlands in general is very good at collecting a lot of data. And this is just some example on the rich data from Statistics Netherlands, which is the Statistics Bureau of the Netherlands, that can estimate, for instance, different social networks relating to households, individuals that exist in different households, their families, where they work, and where they live, and reconstruct networks of potential interactions, which we know are very important to a lot of the issues that we face nowadays that have to do with how individuals interact and influence each other. So this is quite paramount. And once we have good models and have good estimations of those networks, we can try to make experiments about how a specific intervention would unfold in some situation. Here's just an illustration of a network of different individuals. Maybe they could adopt some sustainable technology, and some of them are not informed about its existence, some are informed about the existence, and then some eventually adopt. And we can study how adoption, for instance, cascades through these social networks that we can map into physical space. So this is the idea. And now I'm going to give you a few examples of where I've been applying complexity into different systems. And then in a later second part of the talk, I will focus on a specific, one of these specific examples. So if you have questions about these examples, you can raise your hand and we'll go from there. When did we start? When did we start? How long?
Still have like at 10 past we started. So
Okay.
20 minutes in.
So my research focuses on environmental complexity for human outcomes, and very broadly, I look into how we can intervene in social and ecological systems without creating unintended consequences. And for that, I use a variety of tools. For instance, we've been looking into how climate change and extremes in the weather contribute to the evolution of the coral reefs and the reduction in coral cover in the triangle, the coral triangle. But also how we can use, for instance, satellite image to measure the health of these reefs and try to anticipate when these reefs could potentially collapse. We also look into more theoretical models that describe how different ecological communities that can adapt to external drivers might still face collapse under not a changing environment, but a rapidly changing environment. Then we look into other social ecological systems, for instance, how different social networks or networks of information can affect management outcomes of common pool resources like fisheries. And we do this with the different societal partners. In this case, this project here at the bottom is with the US Forest Service, who's interested in managing the different forests. Or was. Then we also look at human-human interactions, and this is actually where a lot of my research and fundamental interests lie. And for that, we use a variety of tools like peer influence, things that look a bit like epidemics, like social contagion. But also because human behavior is not just contagion, it's not just imitation, there's also some thought process. We also use other tools like game theory and computational psychology to understand how individuals act. And I'll give you some examples of that. A good brief example is the idea of mask wearing that happened throughout the pandemic, which it's a nice example because there's a lot of data available that illustrates how these processes of behavior change at a collective scale are actually very culturally dependent. And here I will just illustrate you the base idea. For instance, we see some patterns in the data, in this case of mask usage, but you can imagine that this applies to technology adoption or other types of curves. And then we try to understand, what makes people wear these masks. And if you try to correlate with factors like risk, right? In this case, illustrated by number of deaths that was happening in the countries, there's really no good connection. And you can think, well, maybe there are other factors like the institutional signals that are imposed in these various countries. And if we consider only those two, that's still not enough. But once you start considering the idea of social norms, so what people see around them, then we can start explaining these different patterns that we see in them. And whilst social psychology has focused a lot in these types of models where we look at what influences individual behavior, what computational methods can do is scale up these interactions, right? Because, well, this individual is affected by its social environment, but they're also part of the social environment of the other individuals. So we can use computers to scale up these interactions to arbitrary influence. So we include that little feedback. And just to show you that this works, there is some illustration of a model that contains these ingredients, including the social feedback, that's really important, and is able to capture a lot of the patterns across the world of mass usage. So the blue is the model output, the red is the data on mass query. And we can show that without the social influence, you can't really get to a good estimation of these models, and you cannot get a predictive model of this type of behavior across different. And of course, once you have that, you can relate that to the different known social cultural properties of different collectives. So here is just showing, for instance, how this idea that at the individual level, risk aversion or policy compliance or conformity with others, how it relates with country level properties. In this case, tightness or collectivism that has been surveyed for many years in the various countries throughout the world, but also other properties of those countries, like GDP, population density, etc. Just to illustrate the power of these tools, and of course I don't do this alone, and I do this in this team, and we tackle these problems using a variety of tools that I would say encompass complex systems tools. So those are complex networks and agent-based models there, evolutionary processes, stochastic processes, and dynamical systems. So those are the key tools that I particularly use in science. And we will have some positions opening in the future. So. What is a stochastic process? There is a very deep question. It's you know what a stochastic variable is? No. So let's say when you have a coin flip, the outcome of that action is, well, the coin is either face up or it's either heads or tail, right? That outcome has different probabilities of happening is a stochastic variable. A stochastic process is when we look at these probabilistic outcomes over time. No? So there is a mathematical tools that we can leverage to better understand how processes that are not perfectly deterministic evolve over time. Any other questions?
So what would a non-stochastic process be?
You mean in real life?
That's real life. Yeah.
That's also a very fundamental question because stochasticity, like what is stochasticity, right? Often we delegate to stochasticity everything we don't know, right? But where it comes from is a very fundamental question. So in general, I would say either nothing or everything is a stochastic process, depending on your philosophy. Right?
Well, in relationship, I'm extremely pleased to see what I see here, because on the other side of the Atlantic, we're struggling to convince people that there is such a thing. That's complexity applied to public policy. That's in itself a challenge. But I wonder if in the work you're doing, if this whole definition of the process, the problem, the solutions, or at least the way of tackling up to the point of creating a solution, how do you jump it onto the policy when you have to deal with the politics and the folks that do not understand the reason, they understand just whether that result aligns with their own priorities. Yeah, that's the one thing. And the other is, when he refers to stochastic, I can tell you, well, a government order is a non-stochastic. There's nothing as normative. Those are the things I have to work with, and I need to frame them with what you come up with these things. How can we build it?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And the way we create this bridge is by involving these people from the start. So ideally, instead of, there's two aspects of it. So one is involving the person from the start. So when you are designing your research, instead of addressing a question that you came up with and then just writing a report and giving the report, you involve the interested parties from the beginning. So that's one aspect. But it's true that when it comes to policy making, it's of course hard to have the people from the beginning because they do have an agenda. So often we work more closely with policy advisors. So the people who create the advice for different policies that then inform governments and local structures. Does that answer more or less?
So you socialize the process.
Yeah. Exactly. So if you think of that, those 4 steps, okay? The first one is actually when we create, when we create this problem, is from a multi-stakeholder perspective, but not just theoretically. So actually there's processes like group model building techniques where you bring people around a table, and then you have ways of making sure that everyone in that table is heard and that they contribute and so on. So there had been quite some research of people using these types of techniques to involve the stakeholders from the beginning. And sometimes the process stops here. Yeah? So you do that, and just creating this shared mental model with the different parties involved is already an outcome in itself, and it's enough to solve the problems that we have, because sometimes it's about coordination, it's about misperception of different perspectives, and that this itself helps. But of course, if you're thinking of the whole process all the way through interventions outside of that table, then you need this cycle. Yep.
How do you define the boundary of your research in complexity science? Because I noted, like at the beginning of the presentation, you showed this urban scale. There was like individual level, and then the urban and social scale. Is it a bit dependent on which stakeholders you have at the beginning of the process? And how do you define, let's say, where you collect data from?
I think in general that's it's very dependent. In the end, it is a function. It depends on the research question that you end up having, and that in turn depends on whoever was around the table, right? I think there's also different approaches. Sometimes you already have a research question and you're just trying to solve that. But the perfect process, let's say, is one where you are also co-designing what is the thing that you want to know, right? You as this collective of people around the world. Once you know that, and you know, when is your time scale of action, what can you intervene on, then you start defining the boundaries of your system. Yeah. But I don't think you can do it without having a very clear research question. So. I think you were first, but at least I saw a hand here.
Okay, no, I had a question about the mask wearing model. I was wondering which data you use there. Do you kind of do a pure forward prediction, or do you also use data like in the time period where you predict? Because at the very least, you have to kind of initialize the model like somewhere. So I was curious, but it's all data from before.
It's for this, let me think. Well, we do different types of validations. So where you kind of break the data in a training set, and then you validate it in the next. In the following, I think we did like.
But what do we see here? I mean, like comparing the red, I guess, and the
this, I think, was through 70% of the data. It's trained on there, and then the rest is the rest. But I think most interesting, there's a second type of validation, which is once you connect this to the properties of the country, for instance, then there is, I guess, some kind of.
But like the 30% training data is at the beginning, or is it?
Yeah, at the beginning. Oh, yeah, not randomly, no.
Okay, yeah. But how can I think of this? Because if there's like a transition later on, and not in the training data, then
Well,
still
if
you're
you-
gonna capture the dynamics sufficiently, and then it kind of
As long as the mechanism is there, right, and the data has enough variability to fine tune that mechanism, then it should hold, right? I think that's the difference between having a mechanistic model that you are fitting, basically, versus doing, just like a machine learning type of prediction that doesn't have a mechanism behind that.
Yeah, I also have a question about the last wearing study. You mentioned that social norms are a key factor. Then those are, I would imagine, very much entrenched in society and hard to alter. So I wonder how you design policy interventions addressing those kinds of variables. Is it even possible to?
Yeah, great question. I think it's it's a big question. If I had the answer to that, I think we would be very far along. What we have done so far, that I can tell you, is just considering it as so. If you ignore that, then you can come up with solutions that are completely wrong once you incorporate them. So I think the first step is to realize that they're there and that they affect your system, and that by the fact that they're there, the best interventions are different. Okay, so that's the first step that we are taking. Now designing, I will talk a little bit more about the tipping point. So maybe this comes back again. But here, for instance, you see that the norm is dynamic, right? Because the policy is also changing, the risk factors are changing. So the system is being trained through this variety of environments. And the norm and the wearing of the mask was changing through the process. So maybe in the beginning of the waves, the social norm was not to wear masks in many countries, whereas halfway through, you would be weirded out if you were not wearing a mask while everyone is. And then at the end, the opposite happened again. So in that sense, I'm talking about a descriptive social norm, like what was happening at that moment, and how that influenced the process. If I ignore that social norm, then I don't have the plot here, but then the model is unable to capture all these patterns in the data. Yeah. And it's more important, of course, when there's more variability in the signals. A bit technical, because you can imagine that if the data is just that, oh, everyone wears a mask all the time, then you don't need a feedback, you don't need anything to train a good model that is just a straight line, right? But if you want to understand how the population responds to this variability of the signals and how it responds over time, then including these social signals is crucial. Did you raise your hand before? You did. Go ahead. Wait. Yeah.
Like I assume that there are some like key behavioral parameters that you have to calibrate either using like because three of them.
Yeah. So we have the how much you weigh the policy signal. So yeah. I will use a very similar model for what's coming next, but it's basically a utility type of model where you put weight into different signals that you have, and you put some weight into the policy stringency, which there's data across different countries that somehow puts all policies together and creates this index. So very stylized model. Social conformity, which is how much you weigh the social signal, how many people around you are wearing, and how much you weigh a measure of risk perception. So we tried the depth and the incidence of the cases. So we had three parameters.
And if you calibrate them, you use like did you calibrate them to the output data, or you calibrate them to using some surveys, some like psychological surveys?
We use the output data, and then the idea was to then compare with these different surveys. So the hypothesis, we actually didn't really confirm our hypothesis, was that tightness and collectivism would strongly affect conformity. So how much weight individuals put into conformity. But we didn't observe that. But of course, yeah, the surveys were also not about mass learning. So I guess one thing that we are also learning through different cases is that even these surveys, they are behavioral, their effect is very behavior specific. Yeah, there was a question back there. Yeah.
Because usually when someone formulates the policy level, unknown policy intervention or control, the last step is to have across government analysis, these and compare this with others. And it's based on classification because like you have just linear responses to the problems that you kind of foresee. And so how does complexity come into the picture? Can be integrated into assessment? Should we need another type of assessment to this thing and just like explain the rationale of the policy intervention?
So I see at least one criticism about the linearity of the models that are typically used for policy advice. And I think their complexity has a lot to add because it allows for these feedbacks that I'm talking about that generate nonlinear patterns and so on. It allows for nonlinear responses. So there, it allows to, so often this linearity assumption means that you're looking at equilibrium responses, right? Where you vary the outcome and you vary the input and it gives you an equilibrium output and you want to know how that output depends on your input. So it doesn't allow you to do dynamical things like this. So this is where complexity can contribute a lot. And then there was this component of the communication, right? And then the communication part is of course very, very hard, right? There's here it's, you can create these scenarios about what could happen when you pull the lever this way or that way, but of course you might be interested in the average and avoiding the worst outcome. Yeah, communicating these things is very complicated, which makes it the more important that people are involved from the beginning. So the people that will be communicating, that will be interested and affected, are as involved as possible from the beginning.
It's okay. So the kind of model which you have on the left, right? You have like 5 to 6 factors, right? I was wondering, basically, I can imagine in the beginning of the process, right? Like you have all the stakeholders, you start discussion. There are a lot of factors and interesting variables that come into play. Do you follow through the entire process and evaluate, okay, which variables should I keep, which variables should I drop? Or is it more like, because of course it's very people keep a lot of things in, but at some point, what really adds to the phenomenon is a different story, no?
So there, answering that question has also various dimensions, right? One is about what the purpose of the model is. If it's just to create this shared mental model, there's often not an issue of there being a lot of variables. Once we come to the predictive part, I agree with you. There's some pragmatism that needs to be done, but there are also tools that allow you to evaluate the impact of different parameters, locally and globally, into your outcomes. So once you do these types of analysis, and actually COVID was a key example of that, where there were a lot of disease models that had thousands of parameters. that people were running them, but then later on, once you actually studied those models, you realize that most of those parameters were not doing much, and the outcomes were depending on just a few key assumptions. So applying those methods also from computational science that are just from statistics also is very important. And the nice thing is that, for instance, the area of AI, where people have these huge models that they have no idea what's happening there, forces them to also develop tools to create a more explainable AI that tell you, okay, what are important factors? So we can also bring those tools and use those tools to these types of models. And we can use those types of models also in parts where you don't expect to have a change, for instance, right? Then a model that is trained to do a specific thing and whose context will not change, you can imagine that you can plug it as a block of a more complicated system. Okay, yeah. That's okay.
Since you're looking at the slide, like I was wondering, on the confidence interval, is it just accounting for like model, the possible results from the model runs, or is it also looking into input uncertainty?
Great question. Great question. So in this particular model, for instance, we didn't even model error. So we fit it's basically trying to predict the mean behavior across simulation. So if we had also had an error term, you would see much bigger bands. So the bands are there, you just barely see them. You would have much bigger bands, but I guess you can do all kinds of things in general. So for this one, is just across parameter uncertainty, right? Because then you fit the model, but then that fit has uncertainty. So it's across those. I think that's it. I think for this figure in particular, that's it. But if you have suggestions, it's still ongoing work. So we
quick follow-up on this, because I'm very surprised that you're able to predict this transition. Because like from my experience, I mean, I work my chest on this. If I fit a model like this, we have some kind of stochastic landscape, and you simulate forward, then it's like probabilistic when the jump is, right?
Yeah.
So like how does this how do you avoid this issue here, or like how do you deal with that?
So you see actually a lot of transitions.
I mean, if you look at the Netherlands, for instance, like this jump in like July or something like that, it seems like you're very sure about this.
The jump in July.
Like this blue jump.
The first blue jump. So the model is the blue.
Yeah.
And then
like in the middle
is the policy stringency. So that turned on. Like the government put some policies in place. And that gives you the first little jump. The second little jump is a combination of the policy being there and the risk of the deaths per million. So I think it basically shifts the utility such that the behavior kind of starts.
Okay, so the risk is also an input
yeah, so
you provide.
So actually you were saying 5 factors. I think it was you. Those two are inputs. Yeah? So this is data input.
Okay, so those you also feed into the model.
Yes.
Okay, then I get it.
Like a co-evolutionary model of disease and policy.
Okay. Yeah,
so the policy was given, the disease was given. It was just about behavior.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So how daring is to think that if you are able to have a great data set, you could potentially chart optimal paths for policy.
Correct. Yes and no. You could, or you could show that you can't. I think that's both.
Because they're all spiraling. It's just the moment when the spiral kicks in.
They're all spiraling. It's just the moment that.
It's just the moment in which the spiral kicks in.
Yeah.
Like they have a progression, but they all seem to go.
Yeah.
It suggests that then there is a potential.
Yeah. I think it's well, I guess the hypothesis is that that's through this social reinforcement, right? It's because if you don't have that social reinforcement, then the models kind of are not good at creating this swish, like you're saying. this spike in behavior. And that's because the feedback kicks in. And once the feedback kicks in, you can get these rapid responses. And this is hopefully also what I'll talk about in a second. We good? All right. So moving on to the second part, which is still on this connection between going from micro scales to macro scales and using complexity tools to that. But I wanted to, well, basically apply it to a context that is the context of climate and climate solutions. And this is also still ongoing. So as we saw earlier, and we've been discussing for the past few minutes, these social norms are really important, right? And we do have this perception for sure for the COVID, as we have experienced it, but also in terms of what technologies we use in our daily lives, right? They're very much dependent also on the technologies that our peers use. But that's not only, also social behavior is very much dependent on it. And so they have been posed as a solution for climate change. So somehow, if we can leverage norms like you were asking, then we can solve a lot of our problems, at least from a demand side perspective, right? And not from the systems perspective, but the systems perspective, but from the social side. And this could be in health, and there is some examples of that, but also in promoting sustainability practices. In general, these social norms, they can be seen as a way of imposing different equilibrium solutions. For those of you, maybe you have a background in economics, they basically create this type of coordination game where societies, individuals in these societies want to be coordinated with others. If everyone around me is doing something, then I also want to do that. If they're doing the opposite, I want to do that too. And because they have these sort of alternative equilibrium solutions, when you think dynamically, that means that when you are then moving from one to the other, there will be a moment in which there will be a rapid shift, right? And those we call typically social tipping points when we think about rapid shifts on social behavior. A lot of the models on tipping, they consider homogeneous agents, right? But in populations, that's often not the case. So here I want to embrace this, if we're also thinking about intervening in these systems, and if we want to know where to intervene, then we really need to think about heterogeneous individuals in such a population, right? So you don't want to look at the heterogeneity in the social systems as a bug that we wash away to make nice models, but actually embrace it and use it to then ask questions about this system. So we know that, for instance, minority opinions that come from specific individuals can sometimes build up and lead to cascades and social tipping in a society. So how does that happen? And when I talk of all this, what kind of behaviors come to mind? Right, for instance, yes. That's the example. Protests in general. TikTok trends, yeah, perfect. What else? iPhone, smartphones, yeah, or the specific iPhone, right? Sometimes Android is like often in like communities, and then Apple stuff in different communities. That's also
cycling thing, but why the Netherlands, this wasn't the thing.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a great example, and it started also with the protests. Children dying. Yeah.
I'm curious, how's this like the cattails? Galaxy distribution first, or even moreover, if we look at the fall of Berlin Wall, and things that none of these models, most fancy models that existed, could predict, which were the tipping points. Because I'm originally from the US, and now we have a fascist government there. And nobody could have predicted even 6 months ago that what's going on right now would exist at this point in time.
Wow. The whole project 2025.
I mean, democracy and change, Nancy McClellan, but you know, I still think that I'm very curious how you go from this, from a mathematical side to, you could say, punctuated equilibrium.
Well, which is also a mathematical, I guess, field, almost at this point. Yes, so a lot of these models and complex systems models, because they allow for feedback, they allow for nonlinearities, they do not produce bell-shaped distributions. Because a lot of these social processes also happen on social networks that have specific structures. Those structures amplify in very nonlinear and non-Gaussian ways how information propagates. So I would say, yes, so complexity science allows us to go beyond bell-shaped things. I can't say that we would be able to predict the fascist government claim we have. Right, so it's a hard question, but I think that's the point, is move beyond what we have so far. And be able to also anticipate some of these rare events. And I think you can only do that if you do have a good sense of the mechanisms that are in the system, right? Because if you were to use exclusively the data that you have about what is now, right? Then you won't be able to anticipate these rare events after, right? So, but if you have a good idea of what mechanisms are in place, even if they are under calibrated, there's a range of parameters in which they could exist, you can still run the scenarios for the different possible values of those parameters. And of course, as we get closer to the tipping point, the rare event, then hopefully these signals are also will be there. And if you already have a good sense of the mechanism, you will be capturing that in the mechanisms. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could in terms of context on that we're already talking about politics, institutions, because as around 10 years old, only thinking of it in terms of agents, for example, and even policy and things that feed into agencies but what about structure? What about institutional signals potentially at different levels? There are also American cities and very different messages right now in the American national level.
I think that goes back to that slide that we had the multiple scales, the spatial and temporal scales, right? So depending on the question that you have, the issue that you have, the speed at which you want to understand this issue, the time scale, then the spatial scales that you will have to consider will also differ. And it is possible with tools like agent-based models and other types of tools to create at least models that you can use to better understand the system at first. I think we are now in a phase where we can calibrate some agent-based models to be able to make predictions about at least the economy and things of that sort. But for sure, for models that you use as kind of boundary objects in these groups to communicate what can happen, what are the different decisions that the different actors are allowed to make in the system, how that affects then the outcomes, that is definitely possible. Great. In terms of the sustainable behaviors, could be about reduction of
flying.
Fine, reduction, yeah, so more sustainable habits, right? Using more sustainable technologies, reducing our demand for high carbon action in general. But overall, I think it's also important to think on these dimensions that we've been talking about. So of course, there's a partisanship type of a dimension that we have in the US. We have this very strong bipartisan context. In Europe, maybe a bit more multi-partisan. But also how different types of behaviors are different, right? They just simply have different cultural charges. So here I illustrate two examples, one of a low social cultural or lower social cultural charge, for instance, the adoption of high energy efficiency technology, but other behaviors like food habits, they are much more socially charged. Right? And beyond that, even within the specific context, like the adoption of the technology, you can think of things, aspects of it that have a stronger peer feedback and things that are probably more individualistic. And here I'm thinking, maybe hypothesizing that if you think of support for a policy, maybe that's more individual, a policy for a specific, to stimulate a specific behavior, that's more individual, less prone to social influence than the behavior itself. So each different study that we make, where we're looking maybe for this tipping, will need to be contextualized. Will lie somewhere in this space and probably a broader multi-dimensional space. So we went on and asked, we collected more than 10,000 responses on individuals about their support for climate policy. So this is in the US, 2 years ago, across different waves. And we asked something, here I'm paraphrasing the question a little bit, but saying that solving the problem of climate change will require public financial support. Several recent policy proposals include funding for measures to respond to climate change. These would end up costing you approximately X, and then there's different X's, different individual X dollars per month, equivalent to 12 times whatever the value that they got, increase in your in what you owe in your annual tax income. And then they can write their support for this policy. And we can look at the different aspects of the individuals in here. One thing that is very important here are some of the significant factors. One thing that we see is very important is, of course, the cost that the policy has. But then other factors like whether you are high income or not, whether your political leaning, gender is important, age is significant, has a small effect, whether you have advanced education, that's the highest level of the questionnaire, etc. And there's also some cross-state variation that we find. And then once we analyze this very large population, and then we know these and other factors that affect support, we can also consider then what would be kind of the break-even cost of a policy that will lead to specific support that would lead to support for this policy. And here we have this distribution. Anyone finds anything interesting about this distribution? So this is then across our sample, yeah, the set of individuals that we asked. These are their estimated break-even costs for the policy. Oh, and my computer is just on fire. Yeah, this is our break-even cost, and I will move quickly so we can finish on time. But just to give you a sense that, well, first of all, the distribution is not very unimodal, has very fat tails, but also a bit worrisome. Our median is around $17 per month And you do see a big chunk of people that are below zero. And that means that they would have to be compensated somehow in order to be supporting this policy. Okay, but of course, different communities. This is for the sample that we collected, right, for the whole country. But of course, different communities will have different distribution of this. And we want to know what makes then these individuals tick. And in order to do that, of course, we can't just look at demographics because demographics are not changeable factors. So we need to look at other factors that affect individuals. And very, very quickly, I want to give you an overview of the type of framework that goes underneath this type of individual-based process, which is one in which individuals are making options over time, maybe supporting or not the policy. This is the example. They will consider different costs and benefits, and those may come from various different places. They consider the alternative. You can consider all kinds of biases that people have, and then hopefully they make a decision, right? This is kind of the traditional way of looking at things, so rational choice. And then if you have a specific individual's willingness to pay here in this arrow and price is decaying over time, then we expect that if this John is, we're tracking their behavior over time, then in the beginning, they will not adopt that behavior. And then once the technology or the policy maybe hits some price, they will be more likely at least to change behavior at that point in time. And then you see the behavior adoption, right? This would be kind of the base. But of course, we have a distribution of these willingness to pay. And then we will have, of course, different transitions for different individuals over time. So in general, the gist, if we consider this set of independent individuals, if you have that distribution of how much they're willing to pay, and maybe you know how price evolves over time, or you have a model for that, or a scenario for that, then potentially you can describe how individuals the collective will change behavior. But of course, this is not all. Individuals are affected by others. We've been talking about this nonstop since the beginning. And of course, they are the others of others. So there is a feedback loop in this system also, right? That can come through how they perceive the values of the different options. So overall, you can say that there's maybe an option A. There's different features of that option, and there's different valuations that individuals put to different features of those options. But one of those features should be social influence. So how many people around me, maybe even in which layer of my social network, is it my family, is it my friends, how many people are doing something. And once you have that, you can start looking at dynamics. Once you take into account also a lot of social psychology literature that now tells you that you can translate all these weights into a metric of peer influence that says, okay, how many of my friends do I need to be doing something in order for me to do something? This critical threshold that changes my behavior. So we flip all those constants, all those parameters into an effective threshold. And of course, maybe that it's not just a single threshold, is a distribution. So we can complicate this. We can use different models. So here I use just a utility model, or you can use some other type of perspective. Prospect theory, all kinds of things. As long as they have a social component, then we can get at this. So once we have that, we can plug everything in and maybe start asking, okay, then in a given community, where can we intervene? So we need to characterize, well, we can study this system, and what we figure is that we can characterize these communities in different dimensions. First of all is, of course, that distribution that we were seeing, but of course, different communities will have different distributions. So they might be more unimodal or more heterogeneous. Maybe there's two types of people in a community. But also the social network that exists in those communities. Here, I'm illustrating this scale of homophily that says, well, when homophily is low, the community is quite well mixed, they're well connected to each other, there's no big clusters. Or there could be more homophily, and then actually communities kind of segregate a little, yeah, or a lot. And then if you want to intervene, you can intervene, for instance, by paying people, or like by targeting the policy in a specific economic group, or things of that sort. Right? So we can have them, the interventions based on how resistant the individuals are. So do I target the individuals who are very resistant, that I would have to pay them in order to do the policy? Do I target the ones that are more amenable? Or if I have information about the social network, do I target the hubs? Do I target the periphery? And so on. Without going into a lot of details, what we see is that when the community is well connected and the process is reversible, so if you adopt the technology, but if for whatever reason the price goes back up, then you stop adopting and do something else, which you've seen in a lot of sustainable technology, right? Then actually targeting amenable individuals is ideal. If you have information about the social network, but you actually don't have information about their preferences, actually it depends on how, as a whole, the population is. If they are more amenable, so if they have already a tendency to change, but they are stuck in their old ways through social pressure, then you should target the low degree nodes, which are typically more out in the periphery of the network. Otherwise, you target the high degree nodes to make this cascade, and you can combine those two. Now, interestingly, once your network starts segregating, then targeting the amenables is not very efficient. And what we can show is that there's actually regions of the space where targeting the resistance is the best strategy. So once you have these types of scenarios and you can characterize your community, then you'll be able to say something about what are good interventions and what are not. And with that, I wanted to close it just by saying that, well, complexity is a world and it has many perspectives. I gave you mine. In terms of what we saw in terms of social behavior, in terms of collective behavior, it is, of course, very context dependent. Right? But these models can help us understand what contexts are required to better understand the different responses of different communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Super interesting. I think given the time, I think we do have space for a couple of questions or so. So yeah, if there's any.
Thank you, so interesting. I was wondering what kinds of data translate into the things you're talking about on the most recent slide, where you got properties of social networks like homophily and stuff. How would you get that from the data?
Different ways. So there are ways of assessing these social networks. And I gave you the example in the beginning, for instance, the CBS, the Statistical Bureau of the Netherlands, has a lot of information on the potential contacts that individuals have, right? Because they know, well, they know their household, so that's kind of like a contact, but they also know where you work. But of course, it doesn't mean that you talk to everyone at your work. So you can get to senses of the networks of potential contacts and then create sub-networks of that. But there is also techniques to measure the social network. But I think more important than that is to find ways of measuring the social network that is relevant for the problem that you are dealing with. And for that, you need to do the kind of surveys that we were looking at, where you ask people about maybe their willingness to do things, but also about, well, ideally you observe them do the things instead of just what they say they will do. Lost my train of thought. that you need to ask about what the social environment that they're in is, and maybe distinguish also between different types of social. How many of your friends do you think support this policy or not? Because then once you also know what they think, then you can compare to reality, and maybe an intervention that you have and that you can show that it is efficient is actually just communicating what is the actual social environment. And it's just the misperception of your social environment that is creating this lock-in. Oh, I believe I'm the only one that wants to act sustainably, and I don't show others that I want to do this because I think they will be against me or not support me, or I just feel unconscious social pressure for that. But that happens for everyone else, and then no one is doing anything because they think no one wants to do anything. You're just correcting that misperception is your intervention. And with the model, you can say, okay, with this, it can go all the way to 50%, just because the system by itself should be reaching 50% of adoption.
Your comment around the information sharing made me think of Janelle Meadows' work on leverage points. And what's exciting about this, I think when I'm reading that, it's always like, leverage points are the most powerful, but you just have to find them if they're possible to find. And it seems like you've developed maybe tools to find some of those. And I was curious whether, one, you've ever integrated some of that sort of systems theory around leverage points, the idea of sort of the hierarchy of where that is, and also maybe has that theory been borne out in your work around maybe like changing the rules of the system, or even like how people are thinking about it much more than stocks and flows?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, so here I would say, for instance, there's a simple type of intervention, for instance, that we were trying here with the targeting different, basically tweaking parameters, which is the lowest, the bottom of the intervention list. Sharing information goes above that. I think, for instance, the idea of integrating these multiple perspectives from the beginning, which maybe in this last work is not the best example of that, but this idea brings us closer to the top of the hierarchy, right? Because you have the people who have the leverage, you have their perspective, and by putting them in the room, you can actually change their perspective immediately. So that's why I was saying often just the first step is what you want, right? And that's the highest level intervention that you can make. So yeah, we try to integrate. Of course, one is very qualitative. We're trying to make it more quantitative, and developing methods to be able to do things. Of course, it's very hard, right? There's a lot of good leverage points are about the things we don't know, right? The structural things that we don't know, but also creating these broad overviews, these sketches of what the system could be like. Also help us identify new structures that we as researchers would not be thinking about. So that helps. So yeah, we try to integrate it as much as possible. And I really like it.
So you said at some point in the you said at some point if we disregard demographics because we cannot hear in the room, then at some point in the presentation.
If we disregard
demographics,
yes. Well, not disregard. I said that we, in order to intervene, we need to ask more than demographics.
Right. Okay. That was my clarification question. So they are still taken into account in that. Okay.
First, when you then create these communities, right? Then it'll be a community of a specific demographics, and then you can still use them. But then, if you want to know where to intervene, you need to know how they respond to the things that you can change. Right? You can't change their age, right? You just change it on its own. Is that a hand?
We have time for this final question.
Yes, exactly.
Good.
So the because you presented the social network data, but that was for Amsterdam, but you also compared like different countries and different contexts. So I was wondering, like, given that for Amsterdam you have this social network data, but I'm assuming for other contexts it was not available. So I was wondering, like, how scalable is this kind of modeling to different contexts?
Yes.
Considering, since you mentioned like the differences in culture.
I think that's it's a fundamental question. We don't know. I think that's the answer. And we are, so one thing that we can do, and hopefully we'll be doing, is to actually use this data that we have and then figure out, at least in the Dutch context still, figure out what is the minimum information that we need in order to still be able to say things about these systems in specific contexts, of course. And then if we also have that data in another country, maybe we're a bit more sure that it is translatable. But of course, ideally, you would have other, and in Europe, there are some other countries that have this. You compare different countries also to see whether, what you find about how much you can hide the network translates across different cultures. But it's a big question. We don't know.
But, one of the things that you said was the findings on how like relevant collectivism is in this dynamic was uncertain, and I was wondering like how that.
You talk about the mask wearing, how the findings that so what we hypothesized was that this peer influence has a strong effect, and that helps us describe the dynamics over time. Great, but then what we thought was a second level of validation that we were talking about. It's like, okay, then this peer pressure should also, so the countries where the peer pressure effect was stronger should also be the countries where surveys that are associated with tightness and collectivism were also stronger. But then what we find is that, well, we don't find that. We find that has the strongest effect in the response to the government policies. And then the effect on the peer influence is washed away. So yeah, it's open still. Yeah.